Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. And today I'm joined by my colleague Anthony Bradley, distinguished research fellow here at the Acton Institute. He is also a research professor of interdisciplinary and theological studies at Kuyper College. And today we'll be discussing his new book, God at Work, Loving God and Neighbor Through the Book of Exodus. This is from Resource Publications, published earlier this year. Anthony, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you've written a lot of books. You have not written a book so focused on a particular book of the scriptures before. What about Exodus made you want to do, why Exodus? There's a lot of books to choose from. There's 66, Protestant canon, I think. Is that right? Okay. Why Exodus?
Yeah, great question. Again, thanks for having me. So one of the things that I noticed over the last few years of teaching Exodus at Kuyper College to freshmen is that the book was incredibly evangelistic. I wasn't expecting that. I was just surprised by the fact that the narrative itself was a really good introduction to people about the totality of who God is. And what I found is I had a number of students who were either new to the faith or no faith at all, or even old in the faith, got this new introduction to a God who's not punitive, but a God who is caring and loving and supportive of his people, and a God who's willing to do whatever it takes to protect his people from evil, but also to do whatever it takes to make sure that his people succeed in the very mission that he has for them. It's really quite interesting to think about introducing audiences to who God is by using a narrative rather than some of the didactic passages in the New Testament, like Paul's corpus or even parts of the gospel. What I notice is that because people have some familiarity with the story, and because it is a story, some of their guards were down. The sort of walls fell down, and the narrative itself was both sort of introductory to God, but also a way to help them understand that God cares both about piety and morality, but also about human flourishing and justice.
Now, this is key, I think, and this is one of those things. I grew up watching the Ten Commandments. This was a staple on sort of network television when I was growing up. I saw the Ten Commandments probably 10 times before I finished the book of Exodus. This is a great cultural touchstone. And there's this great moment in Exodus chapter 10 at the very beginning that I love. When I first read the book of Exodus, there's this moment where God sort of breaks the fourth wall. And, here we go, Exodus 10, 1 through 2. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and your grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am the Lord." The act itself is that you have this inception moment where I'm doing these things so that you can tell the story, so that you can come to know me, which is just I've felt that as I was going through this, you're constantly drawing this out very explicitly. And you begin in the introduction by promising to take your readers on a sort of incredible journey. How does this journey differ from what a sort of commentator would take you on? Because commentators take you sort of through a book of the Bible. This is a little different. One, because it's just the first 24 chapters of Exodus. But then it's very different in tone and style than a traditional commentary. Why did you take this very unique approach?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been interested in is what drives or sort of what motivates people's actions. and what motivates their orientation toward God, whether they are in the faith or not. And one of the things that we see in the book of Exodus is the role of anxiety and how it influences the decisions that are made by lots of different characters in the story. So Moses encounters anxiety about himself, about the story. God responds to that. Pharaoh, of course, has anxiety about who God's people are and what they intend for that, and then he acts out in terms of that. The Egyptians have some anxieties about being this adjacent to the Israelites, etc. And then the Israelites themselves have lots of anxieties, and it determines and influences their continued fidelity or weaknesses in terms of how they relate to God. So what's really unique about this journey is looking at how doubts and uncertainty and how the ruminations about the possibility that something bad might happen in the future actually influences the relationships that everybody has toward God, whether they are in the faith or not.
It really drives the narrative throughout the entire book, this persistent anxiety among all of the leading characters in the narrative. Now, the book is organized also differently than a typical commentary. It's not a line by line sort of thing, but the way you structure the book is very interesting. It's almost in a sort of, you have these snippets that are almost like conversation starters rather than a sort of, you're not setting forth Anthony Bradley's definitive version of what this means. You're trying to give people the sort of conceptual tools and categories to work through this. And I think the structure of this book is very novel. And how did you set upon that? Is this something that you saw somewhere else that you sought to emulate? Is this something that as you were going through it, you just kind of came up with yourself? I find it like a very fascinating structure, and I love how you work through it.
Yeah, so one of the ways that I sort of thought about breaking it up is sort of in terms of if I was preaching through the book of Exodus, how would I break apart these different episodes and the sort of catalog and think about how the story progresses? And so one of the ways to think about it is if you were leading a church Bible study or if you're a pastor, you're going to preach through the book of Exodus, you're going to take these sections with these very natural breaking points and do it that way. And I want people to really sort of get the big picture of the story and then drive them to think about those applications in their own personal lives, in their communities, in ways that I don't have access to. So, for example, if you're living in India, the ways in which these passages applied to your particular culture will be different than you're in China, than different if you were in Dallas, Texas. So I didn't want to get too specific on those, but I wanted to allow people to first understand what the text means, what it means to the original audience, but then also give them some tools and some frameworks to think about how it applies to the local context themselves.
And there are some great, you follow the biblical narrative very closely, and we've talked a little bit about how you structure your overall course in terms of the narrative. But there are also sort of conversation partners that you enlist at various times of the book to sort of help the readers think through these things. And the first one is Gerard Van Groningen, in particular his sort of covenant theology framework. How does that inform your reading of Exodus, and how that works out in the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from Gerard Van Groningen, you really get in the corpus of his work this emphasis on a covenant-keeping God. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because if you think about a God who keeps his promises to his people should have no anxiety about what God is doing in their lives. And so throughout the entire narrative, they are constantly reminded of God who says, I am your God, you will be my people, I am here for you, I'm supporting you, I have plans for you. And to be reminded of that in the midst of uncertainty and chaos and maybe even oppression and doubt, to be reminded of the covenant-keeping God who intends to fulfill and bring to pass the promises that he has made about his own plans with his people. And when the Israelites struggle and falter, they're forgetting those covenant promises, and God has to reiterate again and again and again that I am your God and you will be my people. And so Van Groningen gives us this covenantal framework to understand that God is doing something. He is committed to his people, and that commitment is not going to change based on what his people do or what they don't do, that God is committed to his own promises that he has made to himself about what he intends with his people.
Yeah, he will continue to bring them back again and again and again. And it's a great thing to keep in mind as you read. One of the we've talked about anxiety a couple of times, and one of the theologians that you draw this sort of centrality of anxiety in this from is Reinhold Niebuhr, in particular anxiety and how it relates to sort of freedom and responsibility, because this is ultimately, that's what, we want freedom from the anxiety to exercise responsibility. How does that unpack in the narrative? And what have you found very fruitful in Niebuhr in thinking about anxiety? Because people talk a lot about anxiety today. When we talk about mental illness today, depression and anxiety are the two that get mentioned all the time. But Niebuhr, working in the middle of the 20th century, is finding this a central theme as well.
Yeah, so what we get with Niebuhr is his reflections on what's called the Age of Anxiety, which is from 1946 to 1964. A few things going on. The Cold War is going on. You've got major shifts in the culture in terms of civil rights and sort of women's rights and racial things like that. There's a lot of things going on. High church attendance, so people are really, really anxious. And this is what he says in some of his writings, particularly in the Destiny of Man. He makes the case that anxiety is the precondition for sin. He does have some points of departure with Augustine. He's going to locate that with pride. Mm-hmm. And what Niebuhr says is that it's the lack of trust in God's promises. It's anxiety about whether or not God's going to come through. That is the precondition for sin, that when we trust the Lord in terms of his promises in the midst of chaos and difficulty, we're less likely to sin. If we trust ourselves to handle the vicissitudes of life, sort of doubts, if we trust in ourselves to sort of handle the expectation that something bad might happen, that when we put our trust in ourselves to mediate these situations, that's where sin really blossoms. And so Niebuhr is really, really important in understanding and seeing how the narrative lays out, that it's actually at the moment where Moses and even the Israelites and, of course, Pharaoh and the Egyptians, when they don't believe what God says, that's when they go and do something really stupid and sinful. And so Niebuhr is really helpful in opening out this definition of sin beyond sort of rebellion and pride. He also says that at the end of the day, sin's a lack of trust. It's a lack of trust in the Lord. And we see in the narrative is when that happens, bad things happen.
Yeah. Moses is out on the mountain for a long time. The Israelites get nervous, ask Aaron to create them a new God, a God who is present with them when they're feeling the anxiety of what they wrongly believe is God's absence. And Moses' withdrawal from leadership is an example of this. Now, when we talk about anxiety, we talk about this in clinical terms a lot. And there is a figure in psychoanalysis, Karen Honey, who you bring to bear on this question. What are sort of her insights from psychoanalysis that you've found helpful in thinking through Exodus?
Yeah, so Karen Ornai was a psychoanalyst who wrote a lot in the 40s and 50s. She was one of the first anti-Freudians. She thought Freud's perspective that this Oedipus complex was something everyone struggled with was just complete rubbish. She said it's really not these sort of issues with our moms and things like that. She says, really, it is the uncertainties and doubts that we experience from growing up in homes that lack perfection. So one of the things that she says is that you're not going to you're not going to escape your childhood without some sort of insecurities or doubts or weaknesses in your person that you're aware of, and that what we tend to do is sort of assuage those anxieties, those insecurities in a few ways. She says, first of all, some people will tend to act out on others. So when things are chaotic, they seek control over others. Another way, she says, is that we often become people pleasers because it's easier in uncertainty and doubt just to roll over and be overly accommodating. The third one she says is that we tend to withdraw. She calls that self-resignation. And that one of the ways to avoid the challenges of uncertainty and doubt and chaos and pain and suffering is to just check out completely, right? Leave me alone. And what you see in the narrative of the book of Exodus is how various characters handle uncertainty and doubt and lack of faith in one of those three ways, and how it leads to the proliferation of a lot of evil, and also leads to the proliferation of a lot of disobedience because they're not really trusting what God says. And Karen Ornay has just done a fantastic job in helping to see that when we sort of come out of these homes that are imperfect, that we are imperfect as well. But the way that we manage our imperfections with respect to God does influence the way that we are obedient or disobedient according to what he says.
This was fascinating to me as I was familiar with Freud, but was unfamiliar with Ornay's work. Freud actually does an extensive treatment of the book of Exodus, sort of, in one of the last books he wrote in his life, Moses and Monotheism. And he posits sort of guilt as being the center, and then invents a sort of extra-textual narrative about, the murder of Moses in the desert, which is not, according to the narrative in Exodus, how this goes down. But archaeologists, scholars are not too keen on Freud's, religious and non-religious. It's highly speculative and invented. But he does it because he has this idea going back to totem and taboo, and he mentions this in Moses and Monotheism as I was going back through this. He said, I have never doubted that religious phenomena are to be understood only on the model of the neurotic systems of the individual, which are so familiar to us, as a return of long-forgotten important happenings in the primeval history of the human family, that they owe their obsessive character to that very origin and therefore derive their effect on mankind from the historical truth that they contained. And this is a very, very, very different. If you frame it in terms of guilt, then the religious response is what? Neuroticism, is all of this. If you look at this in terms of anxiety, and anxiety located in persons about God's faithfulness that's always there, that's a very different narrative. A narrative that doesn't involve having to re-engineer or reconstruct some historical happenings that don't happen in the text. It's actually much more textually grounded. And I loved that you were able to draw upon insights of the psychoanalytic tradition while also jettisoning this very unhistorical, decontextualized reading that Freud gives of the Exodus narrative. It's a wonderful way to do it.
And I would say that the framework that I use in this analysis of Exodus could really be used in any other book in the Bible, right? Mm-hmm. What is it that motivates both obedience and disobedience? What is it that motivates people's confidence in the Lord's faithfulness or doubting God's faithfulness? And a lot of it is just simply uncertainty and doubt, or you could think about it in terms of anxiety. And what's interesting is when the Israelites return in chapter 32 to the golden calf, what happened? They completely lost confidence in the God who had done all of these things for generations. And they were like, well, we don't know if he's really going to come through. We need a golden calf. And for the rest of the Pentateuch, all the way through the historical books, all the way through, we see the prophets. That's a primary theme, is that God's people are weak as we are weak. They lose confidence because of uncertainty. And that's when they are more likely to worship and serve and pledge allegiance to idols right? So one way to think about it is the antidote, the intervention to idol worship is trusting in God. This is what Niebuhr says. And that when God's people lose their trust in God, they are vulnerable to the introduction of idolatry into their lives. And we see this particularly in Isaiah chapters 40 to 48, when God's people are being rebuked for their idolatry. And one of the things that Paul says at the end of one of his letters, dear children, in John, dear children, keep yourselves from idols. Right? Keep yourselves from idols. That's always been a struggle for God's people. And we see that particularly in the book of Exodus when they have opportunities to serve and worship idols. But the motivation for that idol worship is often this lack of trust in God, which is according to Niebuhr, motivated by anxiety.
A lot of that is also related to God's sovereignty, because, God is at the point that one turns to idols, one believes not only that you don't have control, but that God doesn't have control, and that you are reaching for something else, something that has control. And this is where you bring Kuyper into the equation, and you bring him in a couple ways. One is this focus on God's sovereignty, but also in social justice and ecclesiology. Kuyper is somebody who looms large, like in a couple of respects in this book. How does Kuyper's sort of unique insights, how do they illuminate the book of Exodus?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So sort of you can think about it in two ways. One is this emphasis, as you said, on God's sovereignty and having God's people trust that God is still in control of the various spheres of private and public life, even though it may not seem like it. Right? So God is still sovereign. He's still in control. He's still working out his plan for the redemption of all things. Even if you don't feel that that's the case or believe that that's the case in the immediate sense, that God is still working. That's right. And secondly, I think Kuyper also does a really good job of helping us see the implications of this lived out. And so in the book of Exodus, what you see is that if it's true that God is sovereign over these various spaces and spheres in society, then God does care about certain things. I mean, he does care about injustice. He cares about slavery. He cares about the ways that women are treated. He cares about the ways that his people are treated, the way that his leaders are treated. He wants them to, in response to his grace and mercy, to live that out with other people in a context of grace and mercy, whether they are within the people of Israel or not. If they're adjacent to the Israelites, they're supposed to treat other people in the same way that God has always treated them. And Kuyper does a really good job of maintaining the integration of both loving God and loving neighbor, and how that looks in various spheres of life. We see this specifically in Exodus chapters 21 to 24, when we see the social implications of what some of these things mean in terms of their fidelity to God. So Kuyper helps us maintain both this emphasis of God's sovereignty. He owns all of these various aspects of culture and society, but God also wants his people to live those things out in really particular ways, not just for their own personal piety, but also for the flourishing of everyone in the community, both the Israelites and the Egyptians, right? That everyone benefits from God's people doing exactly what God says.
Let's break this out and spend a little more time on these sort of spheres, estates. Other folks in the magisterial Reformed tradition talk about them, and in the Lutheran tradition. But for Kuyper, it's spheres. What does Exodus teach us, or what are these first 24 chapters of Exodus? What is it that you hope that individuals take away as they work through the text itself with the help of these thinkers that we've talked about? How should the individual relate to Exodus in his or her own private study and meditation?
Yeah, so I would say that, again, as we see as a ongoing theme in the canon itself, is that God is faithful. God is faithful to his people, and and that the same God who was faithful to Moses and faithful to Israel is the same God who's going to be faithful to those of us who are part of his people today. And that hasn't changed. I mean, God is the same, right? Yesterday, today,
and forever,
forever, right? So the God of Exodus that you read is the very same God that you have direct access through your union with Christ. And so because of that, we ought to have this great, immense confidence that God is still going to do what he intends to do, even though, in my personal life, even though it may not seem like it. So one of the things I would say is that for the individual, it should relieve their anxiety, right? I've just said for years now that Christians ought to be the least stressed, least anxious people in the world because they have a God who is sovereignly working and intending both their good and the good of others.
So one of the things I think that Christians struggle with, and I think people who are unchurched have this conception that, there's an Old Testament God and there's a New Testament God. And then this Old Testament God is wrathful, has all these rules. And there's this New Testament God that's nice and friendly and this sort of thing. And this even bleeds over into the church sometimes, where even Christian people, maybe they realize, they value the Bible as the Word of God, but they have a hard time with the Old Testament. And throughout this, you are bringing Exodus in dialogue with other parts of the Scriptures, including the New Testament. But how do you deal with that challenge when, we open this conversation talking about you love to use Exodus to introduce people to these ideas and to this story. And you mentioned actually explicitly is that you're introducing a non-punitive God, but then people open the text and there's like, God is literally sending plagues on people, like rivers of blood and stuff. How do we help people contextualize that better? How do we help people see the sort of full story of Scripture? And how do you do this in this book?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that dichotomy. Whenever I hear that the God of the New Testament is one of grace, and the one of the Old Testament is one of judgment. My first response is, well, then you haven't really read the Old Testament, because if you read the reason why God does the things that he does, it is always for his glory and the good of his people. And what we see again in the book of Exodus is God is willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that his people thrive and that their thriving is a net benefit to those around them. And that God will fight evil on their behalf. God will part Red Seas on their behalf. God will protect them from permanent oppression on their behalf. That everything that God does in terms of intervening is opening pathways of flourishing for his people. And God has made promises to himself about what he intends for his people. And so understanding that context, and I think this is why Exodus is so important, that understanding this context just unlocks, I think, the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament, which is why there's so many references back to the God of Exodus, right? The God who freed his people from slavery. That is a recurring theme in the rest of the Old Testament for people to be reminded of why God does what he does. And that same God who does those things for his people, we also see this, again, explicated and worked out in the New Testament. What's really important, and this is some of the differences, I think, in the Protestant world, that the Black church tradition is squarely grounded in the book of Exodus. And if you look at the ministries of Martin Luther King Jr., if you look at the ministries of some of the early churches on slave plantations, if you look at gospel music in particular, the spirituals and the hymns, and large majority of all of that content, there's going to be some reference to Moses, some reference to the book of Exodus. So in the Black church tradition, Moses and the book of Exodus is sort of a linchpin in understanding the totality of Christian faith. And those sorts of themes of God's liberating his people from oppression, of course, will have a lot of synergies during the period of slavery and Reconstruction, and even during Jim Crow. That this is the kind of God that we have. That God wants to do these things for the purpose of advancing his people, and to really make those connections and to understand that God is still doing that today. So it just seems to me that Exodus provides one interpretive key to understanding the rest of what God does and why, because God is a God who is fulfilling his promises. If you start in Kings, you might miss this. If you start in the minor prophets, you might miss this, right? If you start in the historical books, you might like, why is God doing this? Well, if you want to understand why those things happened against the other nations, go back and read the first 24 chapters of the book of Exodus.
So you've described very vividly how Exodus has really shaped, the liturgical tradition of the Black church in terms of music, in terms of major themes. For a lot of folks doing Bible studies in churches, the church doesn't have that tradition. They don't have that embeddedness. And I think this book is particularly good to serve a church audience, where you're doing a church Bible study, that sort of thing, working through this, grappling through this. How should churches as a whole, as distinct from individuals, sort of read this book? And maybe churches that aren't as embedded in this narrative as they should be, how can they bring that into the life of their congregations?
Fantastic question. So one of the features of the book is after every major section, I introduce a series of discussion and reflection questions. And that really is an opportunity for churches to use those in Sunday school settings, even small group settings, for people to come together, read the text, understand the text, and then talk about that application in community together. I think that churches really benefit from listening to each other, and particularly letting various members of a community offer their insights in terms of application. One of the things that I did to set the book up, and the way that I did it, is so that you don't have to be an expert in Hebrew exegesis to work through Exodus. You don't have to go to seminary. You can just be a regular person, a regular lay person, and read the narrative, understand what it means, and then in community walk through those applications. So it's really an opportunity for those that may be insecure about their Bible knowledge, those who may not be deeply embedded in terms of the particularities of the text, to get this broad, big picture introduction, to understand some of the themes, to understand some of the sort of motivations of people, and then in community work out what it means for them now and in the future. One of the things I did create that I thought about too late, that I printed out later on, is various plans for churches to work through this work together. Those plans include sort of a 7-week plan, an 8-week plan, a 10-week plan, a 14-week plan, et cetera. So I can make those available as well. We can maybe put those in the show notes.
Yeah, we will include those links in the show notes.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful. We talked a little bit, or you alluded to this, Exodus has sort of seeped out into the larger world at various times in various places. Civil rights movement is a key moment where the sort of themes of Exodus were brought in a very explicit way to a larger society, beyond pulpits, beyond congregations, out into the world. What are some ways that we can bring Exodus out in the world like that today? Because in an environment where even a lot of churches feel very disconnected from this and need to do some work on this, when a lot of individuals look at a text like Exodus and they feel very intimidated by it and they don't know like where to begin with it, it seems like we're living in a different world in that age of anxiety, where there were more churched people, where there were where people could imagine ways of the biblical narrative finding itself out into society, into sort of social reform movements, renewal movements. How do we get to that place again? And how do you bring Exodus out of the church and into the world?
Yeah, so if you read again after the Ten Commandments were given in Exodus 20 to 24, they really do work out the social implications of what this means in terms of how God's people are to interact with their neighbors. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important to keep these things in tension, which is why I mentioned in the subtitle, loving God and loving neighbor, because there's some traditions who want to take the neighbor love part and the justice part and just run with that.
Yeah.
Right. We saw that particularly in liberation theology, which often tended to use Exodus as a way of framing the sort of political theology that supported a lot of Marxism. So, but what's missing there is the emphasis on loving God. Yeah. Right. That's a necessary partner, if you will, to human flourishing and loving your neighbor, is also loving God. It is this emphasis on virtue and praxis, mm-hmm. right? And I think today what people are missing often is this sort of big picture recognition that God is intending. Part of His plan is as it says in parts of the New Testament, particularly in Colossians 1 and 2, that God's redeeming all things. Right. Also in Romans 8, that the Lord is waiting for the sons of sort of to rise up, and so if it's true that God is redeeming all things, right, the part of this redemptive plan is redeeming people, places, things, etc., the whole creation, it demands that God's people have a clue about what that looks like and to provide some direction there. And I think one of the things that Exodus does is it both introduces what is necessary for effective, long-term, sustainable social justice in ways that also is also in union and communion with what God intends. So at the end of Exodus 20, what God says is, I give you these commandments so that you don't sin.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that that's at the end of Exodus 20. Like, I give you these commands so that you don't sin. And then Exodus 21, 22, 23, and 24 work out what it looks like in practice to love your neighbor. So if you want to be the kinds of people who loves one's neighbor in a way that is consistent with what God intends for society and culture, both within God's people and without, you've got to have this piety piece. You have to love God properly in order to do justice well, in order to think about and frame human flourishing well. That those things aren't separated; they're actually incredibly integrated. And I wanted to maintain that tension in the book, that God intends things for His people, but He wants them to work that out both with each other and those around them in really particular ways. And I think that, again, that particular part of Exodus 21 and 24 is one of those opportunities for us to think about what this means for God's people today and in the future.
I love that pairing, and I'm thinking now 1 John, where he talks about, I'm writing this so that you don't sin. But if you sin, there's an understanding there that, like, listen, the calling is there, but God will bring you back in different ways. And these are the ways that God brings not only individuals back, but societies back. And that's very hope-inspiring. But it's also very daunting. I went to a Lutheran congregation once, and I saw above the sort of entrance to the sanctuary was God's work, our hands, which is I've always like loved that, and that's always stuck with me. And how do you work that out? And you work it out in different ways in different contexts. And your book is very good in that there's not a one size fits all solution to every problem, but it gives you a way to reorient yourself, your church, and the relationship to the world according to these biblical patterns, with faith in God at the center of it, that I think is really, really powerful. Now I got to ask, because as I'm going along in this, it's building, and then you get to this Exodus 20 through 24, and then it stops almost at the climax. Why stop at 24?
Great question. So again, if I was preaching through the book of Exodus, there is, in terms of the sort of epic framework, in terms of a narrative arc, so we get this beginning of the story, right? Kill the boys. Moses escapes because the midwives are disobedient, which is fantastic, right? I mean, one of the things I point out is that if it wasn't for a bunch of disobedient women who feared God more than they feared the culture, none of us would be here. I mean, there would be no Christian faith if it wasn't for these midwives. So they're part of the heroes of the story there. But, I want to kind of help people think about the fact that sort of as we sort of work through the narrative, we get to this point in the story in chapter 24, we get the kind of nuts and bolts of what God intends, right? And it's not that the rest of the book isn't that important, but in terms of helping people in the church make these applications, it provides, I think, the model for understanding the rest of Exodus. When we get to Exodus 25 and 26, we get this introduction to the temple and all these sort of things, which would require that'd be a whole nother book, just to kind of work through those. So I wanted to give people something that was practical, really accessible, tied the story together to provide a basis for understanding the rest of the narrative, the rest of the Pentateuch, and the rest of the canon from Genesis to Revelation. So part of it was just simply practical. It was just easier to work through this section and provide people a framework and allow them to make those applications in the present. If I would, the book would have been twice as long if I worked through how to apply the various rules for where the ark should be in the temple and those sort of things. This is sort of a completely different project there.
Yeah. I ask this because there's a tendency, when people start a new year, they think I'm going to read through the Bible, and then they get off to a great start. And there's this, great cosmic vision of the first chapters of Genesis, this very rich anthropology in Genesis 3. You get all of this, you get these fabulous stories of the patriarchs. You get this amazing narrative in Exodus. And then you get to that 20 to 24, and it is this sort of climax. But I think that if you pay attention and if you carefully read what you've laid out for folks here in 1 through 24, that's going to make the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers much easier. How do you view sort of Exodus? And this goes through kind of broad beyond the spectrum of the book, but I'm seeing it as I'm reading it, like these categories are being laid down, and this makes the rest of that journey through the rest of the Pentateuch easier, I think. What have you found in paying close attention to Exodus? How it's enriched, your appreciation of Scripture after Exodus.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I do at the very end of the book is encourage people to do it, just what you said, is to take the categories and framework, these principles of interpretation in the first 24 chapters of Exodus and apply it to the rest of the Pentateuch, right? I think, again, it will help people to understand the why behind the what. Why is God doing this? Why is this important? Why is God so burdened to make sure that his people enter the promised land? Why is he so burdened that they are a particular type of people? Why is he so burdened, as it says in Deuteronomy sort of chapters 30, around there, that you choose life or death? Like, it's your choice. And again, he's reiterating, I have done all of these things for you, and I'm just asking you to trust me. That's all I'm asking you to do, is just trust me in the midst of doubt, chaos, and uncertainty. Trust me with your anxiety. And we see the real struggle there, which again I think continues to be our own struggle to trust God. I've often said that people find it easier to believe that Christ died and was resurrected for our sins. It's often easier to believe that than to believe that God has your day-to-day life in his hands, right? That he has your circumstances also in his hands. I think that's for a lot of people an even more prescient and deep struggle. And that's what we see, is that when you understand that God is a covenant-keeping God, that God intends the best for his people, and that God is going to do whatever he can to thwart the encroachment of his plan in terms of his fulfillment, then the rest of the Pentateuch makes sense, because he wants his people to also be faithful to him. And to, again, as we said a few minutes ago, avoid idolatry. And that's, excuse me, and that's what we see in so much of the rest of the Pentateuch, is that God is situating his people in the midst of all the other nations. He tells them, don't be like them. Watch out for the idols. Stay committed to me, and I will make sure that you are the people that I want you to be, and that you have an impact in the world in the way that I want you to have it. I mean, one of the ways I think people often forget is that God's relationship to the Israelites was not just for them. He is putting on display before all of the other nations what it means to be in close relationship to God. And for those who were adjacent to Israel, for them to also experience that puts them in this position. Well, I want that God to be my God. I want Yahweh to be my God. And then they're grafted in to the community. And so the rest of the Pentateuch is really an application and further explication of what we see in these first sections of Exodus.
Writing is very difficult, and writing makes you think through things new and causes you to learn things, maybe things that you didn't expect. There's a quote that I've never been able to track down from the economist Ludwig von Mises, and it could be completely apocryphal, but it's lodged in my memory, that if you want to learn something, write a book about it. What did you learn? I mean, you don't write a book without having some idea of the subject matter's importance, what you want to do with it, where you want to go with it. But in the writing, there are always twists and turns, new discoveries. How did writing this book enrich your own sort of understanding and experience of Exodus?
Yeah, I think, as you said, I've written a lot of books. This is really, in some respects, out of pocket for me, because I don't do a lot of biblical stuff. I tend to focus on culture, faith, intersection, sorts of issues. But I think, again, because of my work in Black liberation theology and also the work I've been doing over the years in the Black church, I just taken for granted the story. And I don't think I realized just how central the book of Exodus is to understanding every single book in the Bible that comes after it. I think I wasn't too keen. Well, keen's not the right word. I wasn't excited about the book of Exodus in terms of its role of understanding the rest of the Bible, but now I am. Yeah, because I think, again, it's part of this interpretive key. And what's really fascinating to me, I'll give a quick example of this, is the ways in which the patterns that are laid out in terms of God's engagement with Pharaoh and the Egyptians and the Israelites. We see pattern in the Gospels in terms of Christ's own life within dealing with Herod and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Roman officials. You sort of see these patterns. You can overlay them in ways that, to me, have been really, really mind-blowing. Just as an example, right in the beginning of Exodus chapters 1 and 2, of course, there's this edict by the king to kill the males right? To kill the male babies. They were being too fruitful and multiplying, so they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do in terms of Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Pharaoh was afraid of what would happen if they became too numerous. They might overtake him. You got to kill the boys. If you kill the boys, then you keep them at bay. You kill them and overwork them. You oppress them and kill them. Interesting, when Jesus was born, the same thing happened. Right? The edict, Herod, you got to kill these Hebrew babies, but you got to kill the boys in particular. Right? So you see these interesting parallels that one of the ways in which evil and the enemy attempts to undermine the kingdom of God is by killing the boys and killing the men. And we could do a whole nother podcast discussion on exactly how that's happening today. But when you undermine the men in the kingdom and men in the church, when you destroy fathers, when you destroy families, when you confuse people's aspirations with idolatry for career and success and ease, things like that. When you introduce those things, playing video games for 4 hours, like pornography, there's so many ways in which the men are taken out. It just sort of unlocked for me the ways in which the book of Exodus, it's explained so much more about the rest of the New Testament. I just wasn't, again, too tied in to how important the book of Exodus was.
So this is an interesting place for us to go, because actually this brings me full circle to when you first told me you were writing this book. I thought there was a friend of mine who was religious but not particularly devoted to reading the scriptures. And he did a study at his church on sort of male leadership in the Bible. And he got really excited about the figure of Moses. And this became like a standing weekly conversation with me and him about what Moses is doing, how Moses is thinking through these things. And this is one of the spheres that I neglected to bring up in our conversation earlier, which is this sphere of the family. And I think Exodus has something to say on all issues of the family. It has, heroic women role models, as we've talked about. It also has outstanding role models for men. At various points, both Moses and Aaron, at various points, both of them struggle and fall short of what's expected of them. What do you think about, if we could spend a little more time on sort of like that sort of approach? Can Exodus sort of reinvigorate our understanding of the proper role of the family, proper role of sort of models for male leadership, especially in both family and society?
Absolutely. I think most men could relate to Moses because he's invited by God to do things, and he also feels really insecure about his ability to be successful at it.
I can't talk. Get somebody else. Yeah.
I'm not going to be that good at this. And I think most men, I think all men have either articulated or unarticulated doubts about their ability to succeed at things where God has placed them. And I think looking at the character of Moses should give us confidence that it's really not in our abilities, in our capacities and gifts and skills that are ultimately going to drive us to succeed. It's what God does in those contexts in which he places us, because he has goals and plans for the success of what he intends, and he uses us, right? We're the hands. And that doesn't mean that we need to be perfect. We can be weak. We can be inconsistent. We can have doubts. We can have insecurities. We can even have deficiencies. We can not be good speakers or good whatever else. But it doesn't matter that God uses the imperfections of his people to succeed in terms of his plans. And I think for men, that should bring them some confidence that whatever it is that God has, wherever it is that God has placed you, that he can use you regardless of your IQ, regardless of what you believe yourself to be in terms of your gifts and interests, your capacities, that God still has really awesome and good culture-changing sorts of things, community-changing sorts of things, family-shaping systems, sorts of things that God can do. I think the other model for people to think about in terms of the way God does deal with Israel is to think about God as a model father to his children in the midst of the story. So to think about it, what does it mean to model one's fatherhood after the way God fathers these Israelites through this story, through the journey? So there are moments where, of course, God is listening to their groaning, their complaining. We see this at the end of Exodus 2, that God listens to them in their pain, in their groaning, in their struggles, and he does something about it. God allows them sometimes to fail and to reflect on their failure with the Lord. God also intervenes and preempts them from going off the cliff too much. He's a protector. He's a provider, right? And that God provides all the things that they need. He provides them the sustenance that they need physically. He provides them spiritually with sustenance. He provides them to them protections against the enemy. That he's a provider. So God is a protector. He's a provider. He's one of mercy and grace and commitment and faithfulness. And I think the way that God fathers Israel through these first 24 chapters is a fantastic way for any man to model his parenting style with his own family.
Anthony, thank you for fathering this book and for providing us and the church with a wonderful on-ramp to God's own story for us. Thank you so much for being with us on Acton.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.